Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to help you get informed on some of the world's most complex issues. And today, well, we're tackling something that's incredibly complex and carries just immense emotional weight: the ongoing Israel-Hamas conflict. Trying to sort through all the information out there, it can feel, frankly, overwhelming. But that's exactly why we're doing this deep dive today.
Exactly. We're going to provide a comprehensive look, chronological, thematic, trying to really understand the war from its historical roots right up to the latest developments. And importantly, we're drawing only from the sources provided to us. The goal here is to pull out the key insights, help you connect the dots, and give you a solid, well-informed perspective. We're not taking sides.
No sides, just unpacking the critical events, looking at the motivations, the complexities, the ripple effects, all aimed at helping you grasp what's most important here.
So where do we start? It has to be October 7th, 2023, that initial spark.
Right. A truly shocking event. This unprecedented attack, land, sea, air, launched by Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the PIJ, from Gaza.
Yeah, I mean, they used explosives, even bulldozers, to breach that heavily fortified border. That alone was a huge statement against Israel's defenses.
And they coordinated it, right? Knocking out communication networks at military posts.
Allowing them to get into civilian areas, communities, largely undetected at first. Some even used motorboats, motorized paragliders.
It speaks to a level of planning designed for, well, maximum surprise, deep penetration.
And the result was just immediate, profound devastation. Over 1,200 people killed, mostly Israeli citizens.
Families in their homes, people at an outdoor music festival. It became the deadliest single day for Israel since its founding in 1948.
Absolutely tragic. And then the hostages, more than 240 people taken, snatched from their homes from that festival.
And there were later reports, like a UN report in March 2024, finding evidence of sexual violence against some victims too. Horrific.
And the timing. It happened on Shemini Atzeret, a Jewish holiday, which meant many IDF soldiers were actually on leave.
A factor in the initial response, no doubt. So Israel's reaction.
Swift. Definitive. The very next day, a declaration of war, which, was the first formal declaration since the Yom Kippur War in 1973.
Wow. And militarily.
The IDF began airstrikes on Gaza almost immediately, mobilized over 350,000 reservists in the days that followed, and then on October 9th, that order for a complete siege of Gaza, cutting off essentials: water, electricity, food, fuel.
Okay, so that's the immediate trigger and response. But to really get this, we need to rewind a bit, right? Understand the history.
Absolutely. You can't understand October 7th in a vacuum. The roots, well, they go back decades. 1948, the creation of Israel, the Nakba, the mass displacement of Palestinians. Many of those refugees ended up in the Gaza Strip.
And then Israel occupied Gaza in the 1967 Six-Day War.
Correct. Fast forward a bit, you get a glimmer of hope, perhaps, with the 1993 Oslo Accords, the idea of a two-state solution.
But Hamas, which was founded back in '87, rejected that plan completely.
They did. They saw it as a sellout. They even launched, terror attacks specifically to derail the Oslo process.
And eventually, that peace process collapsed. Then in 2005, Israel pulls its settlers and troops out of Gaza unilaterally.
Right. And that withdrawal, it paved the way for internal Palestinian conflict. By 2007, Hamas emerges as the de facto ruler in Gaza, pushing out the Palestinian Authority.
Which then prompted Israel, and Egypt too, to impose that blockade on the Gaza Strip.
Exactly. Setting the stage for, well, over a decade and a half of this cycle of conflict and containment.
Yeah, we've seen these cycles before, haven't we? Major conflicts between Israel and Hamas, 2008, 2012, 2014, 2021.
But they tended to be shorter, weeks usually. Fewer Israeli civilian casualties compared to October 7th, and they'd end temporarily weakening Hamas maybe, but often with these ceasefire deals.
Deals that sometimes eased the blockade slightly, allowed some aid in, the so-called money for quiet approach.
Yeah, that term was used. Buying temporary calm with concessions, maybe some Qatari money facilitated rather than tackling the root issues.
Which brings us to a really critical point, a kind of blind spot leading up to October 7th.
Yes. This long-held assumption within Israel's defense and intelligence community, the belief that Hamas had basically been deterred.
That any flare-ups were, I suppose, manageable? Containable?
Precisely. That Hamas was more interested in governing Gaza, getting concessions, than launching a massive strategic attack like this. October 7th just shattered that assumption, catastrophically.
A massive intelligence failure, essentially, underestimating their capabilities, their intentions.
Absolutely. And it wasn't happening in isolation. Israel itself was dealing with a lot of distractions.
Like what?
Well, Ongoing violence in the West Bank was consuming a lot of security attention, huge domestic political turmoil.
Huh. Netanyahu's far-right government, the judicial overhaul plans, the massive protests.
Exactly. There were even warnings about IDF readiness because of reservists protesting the judicial changes, plus simmering tensions up north with Hezbollah in Lebanon.
So a lot pulling focus away from Gaza.
It seems so. And there was even a civilian commission of inquiry report later, November 2024, that put a lot of blame on the government, specifically Netanyahu. It argued his policies had effectively bolstered Hamas over the years while undermining coordination, sort of a divide and rule strategy gone wrong.
And zooming out even further, the regional picture was shifting too.
Definitely. The U.S. was talking about its pivot to Asia, maybe trying to step back a bit from the Middle East. There were big hopes, especially in the U.S. and Israel, for an Israeli-Saudi normalization deal.
A deal that largely excluded the Palestinians from direct talks, right?
That was a major point of contention. Meanwhile, Iran was busy consolidating its axis of resistance. Hezbollah, Assad in Syria, the Houthis in Yemen.
Yeah, Hamas, where did they fit? Their relationship with Iran has been up and down.
It has, but after about 2017, Hamas grew closer to Iran again, receiving significant support funding, weapons, training. Many observers believe a key motivation for the October 7th attack was precisely to disrupt that potential Israel-Saudi deal.
To torpedo normalization, keep the Palestinian issue front and center, and maybe weaken that emerging U.S.-backed regional alignment.
That's a widely held view, yes. For Hamas and Iran, that kind of normalization would have been a major setback.
Okay, so that sets the stage. Now, the war itself unfolds after October 7th. The humanitarian impact.
Immediate and devastating in Gaza. Within just 3 weeks, over 1.4 million Palestinians were internally displaced, fleeing the bombardment.
And the death toll climbed rapidly, quickly becoming the deadliest conflict for Palestinians since 1948.
And the nature of the fighting in Gaza. Those extensive tunnel networks Hamas built. It made it incredibly difficult for the IDF to locate hostages, target militants, without causing huge civilian harm.
A brutal urban warfare scenario.
Very much so.
Was there any break in the fighting early on? Any deals?
There was. In late November 2023, Qatar and Egypt managed to mediate a ceasefire, a prisoner exchange.
Right, I remember that. How long did it last?
It was a 7-day pause in the fighting. During that time, 110 hostages held by Hamas women, children, foreigners were released.
In exchange for?
In exchange for 240 Palestinian prisoners held by Israel, mostly women and teenagers.
But the pause ended.
It did. Fighting resumed. And Israeli ground forces then pushed south into Khan Yunis, a major city in southern Gaza.
Which led to another wave of displacement.
A massive wave. Huge numbers of civilians fled further south, towards Rafah, right on the border with Egypt. Eventually, over half of Gaza's population, more than 1 million people, were crammed into Rafah.
An incredibly dangerous and desperate situation. And internationally, how is this playing out?
Well, the pressure on Israel really started mounting significantly from late 2023 into early 2024. The high civilian death toll, the sheer destruction in Gaza, it was drawing widespread condemnation.
I recall President Biden making comments about Israel potentially losing international support.
He did. Around December 2023, he warned about that. But Israeli leaders remained focused on their war aims, stating their intention to eventually go into Rafah to dismantle Hamas's remaining battalions there.
Which sparked huge international alarm given how many civilians were sheltering there.
Exactly. It led to a very public rift between Netanyahu and Biden. Biden administration officials expressed serious concerns, even mulled conditioning or withholding some military aid.
And at the UN.
A notable shift in March 2024. The U.S., for the first time, didn't veto a UN Security Council resolution demanding an immediate ceasefire for the month of Ramadan. It also called for hostage release. The resolution passed.
Did it lead to a ceasefire?
No, unfortunately, it didn't halt the fighting, and the humanitarian situation just kept getting worse, made even more tragic by specific incidents.
Like the strike on the World Central Kitchen Aid convoy.
Yes, that was April 1st, 2024. An Israeli airstrike hit vehicles clearly marked as belonging to World Central Kitchen, killing 7 aid workers.
Foreign nationals among them.
Yes. British, Polish, Australian, a Palestinian, and a dual U.S.-Canadian citizen. It caused a huge international outcry.
Did Israel take responsibility?
The IDF did. They investigated, fired some officers, and called it a grave mistake resulting from misidentification, a terrible chain of errors. But it severely impacted aid operations.
It sounds like a period of intense fighting, mounting pressure, and real tragedy. Then came that dramatic hostage rescue operation in June 2024, Operation Arnon.
Right, June 8th. Israeli special forces mounted this complex daytime raid in the Nuseirat refugee camp in central Gaza.
And they rescued hostages.
They rescued 4 hostages, all of whom had been abducted from that Nova Music Festival on October 7th. It was seen as a major tactical success in Israel.
But it came at a
Of
cost.
a very high cost, according to Gaza's health ministry. The raid involved heavy fighting, intense Israeli air support covering the extraction. Palestinian officials reported over 270 people killed in the vicinity during the operation.
Including militants or civilians?
The exact breakdown is disputed, as is often the case, but it's clear a very large number of Palestinians died during the raid. Israel disputed the numbers, but acknowledged intense fighting. The operation itself was renamed after the commander, Arnon Zamora, who was fatally wounded during the rescue.
What was the impact of this inside Israel? A boost for Netanyahu, relief for the hostage families.
It was complex, huge celebrations for the rescued hostages, obviously, but it also fueled these furious protests that were already happening.
Protest demanding
The government do more, make a deal, to free the remaining 120 or so hostages, and increasingly calls for Netanyahu's replacement. The rescue highlighted that military operations alone might not bring everyone home, and the human cost was enormous.
And didn't a key political figure resign right after?
Yes, the very next day, Benny Gantz, a former general, Netanyahu's main political rival, who had joined the emergency war cabinet after October 7th, he resigned.
Why then?
He'd given Netanyahu an ultimatum weeks before, demanding a clear post-war plan for Gaza, including hostage release strategy. He felt Netanyahu was prioritizing political survival over national interest. His departure weakened the image of national unity.
And just days later, another UN resolution.
Correct. June 10th, UN Security Council Resolution 2735. This one endorsed a 3-phase ceasefire proposal that President Biden had actually laid out publicly at the end of May. It called for an immediate ceasefire, release of hostages, withdrawal of Israeli forces, and a major reconstruction plan for Gaza.
So, a framework for ending the war. Did it gain traction?
Well, it laid out a path, but getting both sides to fully agree and implement it, that remained the challenge, which leads us into the shifting dynamics of the negotiations through 2024 and into 2025.
What changed in the talks?
There were some subtle but significant shifts. In early July 2024, reports emerged that Hamas, in the ongoing talks mediated by Qatar and Egypt, had dropped its insistence on a permanent, upfront end to hostilities as a precondition for phase 1 of a deal.
That sounds like a potential opening.
It seemed like one, but then Netanyahu introduced a new, or perhaps newly emphasized, condition from the Israeli side, insisting that Israel must retain security control over the Philadelphia corridor.
That's the border strip between Gaza and Egypt.
Exactly. Netanyahu called it the oxygen line of Hamas, arguing Israel needed to control it to prevent future weapon smuggling. This became a major sticking point.
And during this period, Hamas suffered some major leadership losses.
Huge losses. In July 2024, an Israeli airstrike in Gaza killed Mohammed Deif. He was the elusive head of Hamas's military wing, the Qassam Brigades, considered the mastermind of the October 7th attack. A massive blow.
And wasn't there another major figure killed soon after?
Yes, later that same month, Ismail Haniyeh, Hamas's overall political leader based abroad, was assassinated in Tehran, reportedly by an Israeli strike, while attending the Iranian president's inauguration.
So Deif and Hani gone in the same month. What did that mean for Hamas leadership and the negotiations?
It effectively left Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader inside Gaza, as the dominant figure. He's known for being more hardline, potentially making negotiations even tougher.
Interesting. And around the same time, wasn't there some movement on Palestinian reconciliation?
There was. Also, in July 2024, rival Palestinian factions, Fatah and Hamas, signed a reconciliation agreement in Beijing, brokered by China.
China stepping in as a mediator? That's significant.
Very. Aimed at forming a unified technocratic government for both the West Bank and Gaza post-war. Whether it holds is another question, but it signaled shifting regional diplomacy.
Meanwhile, the humanitarian situation in Gaza, did it improve at all with these talks?
Sadly, no. It just kept getting worse through 2024. That Lancet study published in July estimated maybe 186,000 total deaths, direct and indirect, due to the war's impact on healthcare, sanitation, nutrition, a staggering toll.
Indirect deaths, meaning from disease, lack of medical care.
Yeah, exactly, the collapse of the health system. And then, in mid-August, the first confirmed case of polio was detected in Gaza, a 10-month-old infant.
Polio. That's terrifying in those conditions.
Deeply worrying. UN agencies immediately called for pauses in fighting to allow for emergency vaccination campaigns. It highlighted the catastrophic public health crisis unfolding.
So, amidst all this, was there eventually another ceasefire deal reached?
Yes, after months more of on and off negotiations, mediated again by Qatar and Egypt, a significant ceasefire and exchange agreement was reached, intended to start in January 2025 and last through March.
What were the terms of that deal?
It was structured in 3 phases. Phase 1, the initial focus, involved a cessation of hostilities for a set period. During this time, Hamas would release 33 Israeli hostages, specifically women, the elderly, the sick, and wounded.
And in return?
Israel would release a much larger number of Palestinian prisoners, reportedly around 1,900. Phase 1 also included the withdrawal of IDF troops from populated areas within Gaza, allowing displaced civilians to return, and a major surge in humanitarian aid aiming for 600 trucks a day.
That sounds like a substantial agreement. How did the implementation go?
It was revealing. Hamas tried to manage the optics of the initial hostage releases very carefully. Some early releases featured hostages appearing relatively okay, even smiling or waving, seemingly choreographed.
An attempt to portray humane treatment, control the narrative.
Very likely. It shows how even these moments become part of the information war. But that image didn't last.
What happened?
By early February, when some of the male hostages started being released, they appeared pale, gaunt, clearly showing the harsh realities of their captivity. The carefully constructed facade crumbled pretty quickly.
And what was happening outside Gaza during this ceasefire?
Well, even with the pause in Gaza, violence actually spiked in the West Bank. Some saw this as Netanyahu perhaps allowing security forces more leeway there to appease his far-right coalition partners who were unhappy about the Gaza ceasefire.
Politics interfering again.
Always a factor. And then there was international controversy. Donald Trump, back in the White House by then, made comments in late January suggesting he wanted to just clean out Gaza and relocate residents abroad.
Relocate Gazans.
Yes, it drew immediate, strong condemnation internationally, including from the UN Secretary General, who warned against any talk of ethnic cleansing or dehumanization.
What about the aid? Did it actually increase to 600 trucks a day?
The flow did increase, but reports suggested it was inconsistent and fell short of the promised levels and didn't reach everyone in need effectively. This led to more friction, threats exchanged between Hamas and Israel, about whether the hostage releases would continue if aid targets weren't met.
So the ceasefire was shaky from the start. Did it hold?
Ultimately, no. The deadline for starting negotiations on Phase 2, which was supposed to deal with the release of male soldiers and the remaining men, passed on February 3rd without talks really beginning.
So Phase 1 completed, but Phase 2 never started.
Essentially. An informal truce kind of lingered for a while into mid-March, but then Israel reimposed a stricter aid blockade and cut electricity again.
Why did the fighting restart formally?
Netanyahu faced immense pressure from within his right-wing coalition, who felt the ceasefire had given Hamas too much breathing room. They wanted the war resumed to achieve the stated goal of destroying Hamas. And crucially, he seemed to get backing from the U.S. administration to restart operations.
So the ceasefire collapsed completely.
Yes. On March 18, 2025, Israel renewed its heavy bombardment of Gaza. Reports cited over 400 people killed in the initial wave.
And ground operations.
They launched new operations aimed at bisecting the Gaza Strip, creating new military corridors, effectively isolating Rafah even further. There was also a controversial plan floated to have aid distribution managed by a private entity, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, raising concerns about bypassing UN agencies.
And the humanitarian outlook by then.
Dire. The UN's OCHA projected that over half of Gaza's population was facing emergency levels of food insecurity, and about a fifth were already in catastrophe or famine conditions. Just absolutely devastating.
Around this time, wasn't there a significant shift in U.S. policy regarding direct contact with Hamas?
Yes, a really unprecedented move. The U.S. administration began engaging in direct talks with Hamas.
Direct U.S.-Hamas talks. Why?
Primarily focused on securing the release of the last remaining American hostage, Eden Alexander. It was a major departure from previous U.S. policy.
How did Israel react?
Reports suggested Israeli officials felt blindsided by this direct engagement, especially as it coincided with the U.S. also announcing a separate ceasefire deal it had negotiated with the Houthi rebels in Yemen.
A Houthi ceasefire that didn't require them to stop attacking Israeli shipping.
That was the report, yes. It added to the sense of friction between the U.S. and Israeli governments at that point.
Did the direct talks work? Was the American hostage released?
Yes. Eden Alexander was released in May 2025. President Trump publicly hailed it as a positive step, a gesture of good faith by Hamas, facilitated by these direct talks.
Let's pull back and look at the global reactions throughout this period. How did the world respond initially to October 7th?
There was widespread condemnation of the attack itself, particularly from Western nations, but also India, Japan, South Korea.
Right.
They labeled it terrorism unequivocally.
But not universal condemnation of Hamas specifically.
No. Many Arab countries, plus Turkey, Russia, China, while expressing concern and calling for de-escalation, they often refrained from condemning Hamas directly. Instead, they tended to emphasize the broader context of the occupation and called for Israeli restraint, highlighting those deep international divides.
And the legal dimension. This war has seen a lot of action in international courts.
A huge amount. Accusations of genocide against Israel were leveled quite early on. South Africa took the lead in bringing a case to the International Court of Justice, the ICJ.
And what did the ICJ rule?
In January 2024, the ICJ issued provisional measures ordering Israel to take all possible steps to prevent genocidal acts in Gaza and to allow humanitarian aid to enter unimpeded. It didn't order an immediate ceasefire then, but it was a significant ruling.
Did they issue further orders?
Yes. In May 2024, as Israel was poised for or beginning its Rafah offensive, the ICJ issued another order, specifically telling Israel to immediately halt its military offensive in Rafah, citing the extreme risk to the civilian population.
And what about individual accountability? The International Criminal Court, the ICC.
That was perhaps even more dramatic. In November 2024, the ICC prosecutor announced applications for arrest warrants.
For whom?
For Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu and his then Defense Minister Yoav Gallant. The prosecutor cited reasonable grounds to believe they bore responsibility for war crimes and crimes against humanity, specifically related to intentionally depriving Gazan civilians of essentials like food and water.
Arrest warrants for sitting Israeli leaders.
Yes. And simultaneously, warrants were sought for Hamas leaders too, for Mohammed Df before his death was confirmed, and Yahya Sinwar.
On what grounds for the Hamas leaders?
For alleged responsibility for crimes committed during and after the October 7th attack, including murder, hostage-taking, and accusations of cruel treatment and sexual violence against hostages.
These warrants, against both sides, really marked a major moment in international justice efforts related to this conflict, didn't they?
Absolutely. A profound step, applying international law at the highest levels, though enforcement remains complex.
Beyond the courts, what were some of the other major ripple effects globally?
Well, the Houthi attacks in the Red Sea had a significant impact, targeting commercial shipping they claimed was linked to Israel or the U.S. and UK.
Disrupting global trade routes?
Significantly forced many shipping companies to reroute around Africa, increasing costs and delays. It also led to U.S. and UK military strikes against Houthi targets in Yemen.
And attacks on U.S. forces elsewhere.
Yes, Iranian-backed militias in Iraq and Syria launched numerous drone and rocket attacks against U.S. bases in the region. One drone strike in Jordan in January 2024 killed 3 U.S. soldiers, leading to retaliatory U.S. strikes in Iraq and Syria. It really showed how this conflict could ignite wider regional instability.
What about the impact closer to home, say in the U.S. or Europe?
The war created an incredibly divisive atmosphere. We saw a deeply concerning wave of anti-Semitism, but also Islamophobia and anti-Arab or anti-Palestinian racism.
Documented increases in hate incidents.
Yes, organizations like the Anti-Defamation League reported huge surges in anti-Semitic incidents. Similarly, the Council on American Islamic Relations, CR, reported unprecedented levels of anti-Muslim and anti-Palestinian bias incidents.
And university campuses became major flashpoints.
Huge flashpoints. Pro-Palestinian protest encampments sprang up on numerous campuses, especially in the U.S., in the spring of 2024. This led to intense debates about free speech versus ensuring student safety, accusations of anti-Semitism within the protests, and concerns about Islamophobia in the responses to them.
Were there official studies on this campus climate?
Yes, several universities commissioned reports. Harvard's, for instance, found that significant numbers of both Jewish and Muslim students reported feeling physically unsafe on campus at times, and many felt afraid to express their opinions on the conflict for fear of backlash or professional repercussions. It really exposed deep fissures.
So back to the situation on the ground in late 2024. Was there any renewed push for a deal after the summer fighting?
Pressure certainly continued. A grim discovery in August 2024 further fueled public anger in Israel.
What was discovered?
Israeli forces found the bodies of 6 hostages who had apparently been executed by their captors. This led to absolutely furious protests across Israel, huge demonstrations, even calls for a general strike, demanding the government prioritize a hostage deal above all else.
But Netanyahu held firm.
He seemed to. He continued to insist on that demand for Israeli control over the Philadelphia corridor as a precondition. At the same time, Israeli forces were heavily engaged in Lebanon targeting Hezbollah.
Including killing Hezbollah's leader.
Yes, in a major strike in late September 2024, Israel killed Hassan Nasrallah, Hezbollah's longtime influential secretary general in Beirut, a significant escalation in that northern front.
Then came another major event, the death of Yahya Sinwar.
Right. In October 2024, the IDF announced they had killed Yahya Sinwar during a firefight in Rafah. His death removed Hamas's top leader inside Gaza from the equation.
Did his death change the dynamic for ceasefire talks?
The international community certainly tried to seize the moment. Egypt quickly put forward a new proposal, suggesting perhaps a short pause in fighting, maybe linked to the release of a few specific hostages, perhaps U.S. or Russian citizens, to build momentum.
How did Israel respond?
Reports suggested the Israeli delegation was hesitant, waiting to see the outcome of the upcoming U.S. presidential election. The calculation seemed to be that a potential second Trump administration might offer Israel more diplomatic leeway or support for its security demands compared to the Biden administration.
Politics, again, playing a role in the timing. And one more significant development around that time involved UNRWA.
Yes, also in October 2024, the Israeli Knesset passed a law seeking to ban UNRWA, the main UN agency providing aid to Palestinian refugees, from operating in Israel and potentially restricting its activities in the occupied territories.
This was linked to earlier allegations about UNRWA staff involvement in October 7th.
Correct. Israel had made those allegations earlier in the year. However, it's important to note that an independent review, commissioned by the UN and led by former French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna, had reported back in April 2024.
What did that review find?
It found that while there were some issues, UNRWA actually had robust systems and procedures in place to ensure neutrality, and that Israel hadn't provided concrete evidence to support its claims of widespread infiltration by militants. Despite this, the Knesset moved forward with the ban.
Wow. Okay, we've covered a tremendous amount of ground. From the historical roots, the shock of October 7th, the brutal war, the humanitarian crisis, the complex hostage negotiations, the leadership changes, the international legal battles, the global ripple effects.
It's incredibly multifaceted, isn't it? A conflict with such deep history, layers upon layers of trauma, political maneuvering, military action, and profound human suffering on all sides. And it's still unfolding.
Absolutely, constantly evolving, which really underscores why trying to understand these layers is so crucial.
Which I suppose leads us to a final thought, something for you, our listeners, to consider. In a conflict loaded with such a long, painful history, such profound grief and loss, and such deeply entrenched narratives on all sides, what could genuine, lasting security actually look like for everyone in the region?
And perhaps how can those different, often competing historical narratives even begin to be acknowledged in a way that might allow for some kind of path forward?
A difficult question with no easy answers.